even the radical elements of the left tend now to adopt the kind of identitarian politics of the liberal left rather than the communitarian socialism of the traditional left. And this means that we have arrived at an increasingly fractious moment where groups that would have once been together formed a communal socialist bloc to push politics in a different direction are now antagonistic towards each other in ways that I've never seen during my adult life.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Jonathan Astro. With me is Ricky Orpike. How are you, Ricky?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm jazzed.
Yeah, pretty jazzed up.
Yeah. Good conversation tonight. But before we get into that, how are you is what I want to know, because, and this is all connected, people. You went to a kind of a block party recently, and of a very particular kind. Tell me about it.
I did, yeah. I got pretty jazzed up myself. I went to the celebration that happened at the front of Parliament here in Melbourne to celebrate the resignation of our Premier, Dan Andrews, who was responsible for the longest lockdown in the world, but also a bunch of other woke policies around gender ID and just some other dodgy stuff as well. So there was a celebration. It was a lot of fun. I was a little bit disappointed there weren't more people that came out to celebrate.
Deluded. You're so deluded. You keep saying this like you don't live in Melbourne. Like, you live in Melbourne. I'm surprised 10 people came. Everyone I've spoken to there just was totally complicit in that whole deal. Or they said, "Oh, it was all for the good of the state," or whatever.
That's true. There are a lot of people that went, it's about saving lives. But I thought there'd be more, just because when some of the lockdown protests happened, there were some pretty big ones that happened towards the end, because we just sort of had a gutful by the end of it. So I was hoping that there would be more people. But
they're recovering from their rubber bullet wounds.
That's right, they are. But I was a little bit disappointed also that the celebration was, like, obviously we're celebrating the fact that this guy's gone, and who knows what's going to happen next, if the next person's going to be worse or better or whatever. It's hard to know. But the way some people were celebrating like we had triumphed was a little bit hard to take, because this guy, Dan Andrews, he did go out on his own terms, and he went out on top, and he's going to sail on to some plum job in New York or something.
Where's America, isn't it?
And yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, I have heard some people say, some people that I know on the inside, that Daniel Andrews doesn't go anywhere in public in Melbourne without a bulletproof vest on. So that does show you that he's not a very popular man here. In some regards, I mean, the big leftist population that we have here definitely do support him pretty hard. But there were some pretty loose units at this celebration as well, which is pretty funny. And someone donated like $2,000 worth of beer that was just free for people to have. And
get on the beers.
I kind of almost wish I came in costume. I wanted to come in like a gimp suit that said, like, "Lock me down harder." And that, and that I had, like a COVID mask on, and that's how I wanted to do it. But
so you wanted to become a full cooker. Oh, you love that term.
I hate this term so much, cooker. It gets thrown around so much, and I was thinking about it.
I don't know what it means. Really.
I think it's just a slur that gets thrown at working class people. Honestly, that's what I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's supposed to mean that you're a conspiratorial person, that you I don't know, that you're a meth head or something, or
cooked. Are you cooked?
I don't know.
I don't know. Look, I think it's fringe. All I'll say is that Daniel Andrews is just another one of these leaders that didn't get it the way I wanted him to get it. I wanted the people to vote him out.
Yeah, that's right.
I didn't want him to walk away. So, but they never were going to vote him out. So,
yeah. Well, I will say the people that were there struck me as old school lefties, people that were concerned about economic change and class, and who didn't give a shit about wokeness or
identity. Am I allowed to say
politics.
You ran into Angie?
Yeah, sure.
Well, you ran into Angie. She's
I did.
One of a friend of the show.
Yeah. She was there with one of her friends. They had some sort of turf sign up,
Yeah, that's good. Making friends all around town, Ricky
Yeah.
Allpike.
Yep.
Well, anyway, this is all related because our two guests, Simon Winlow and Steve Hall, wrote a book called The Death of the Left. It's all about the left, a subject that one of our portfolios here at the New Flesh. And I found it to be fascinating and quite uplifting in the end.
Yeah, it does come around there at the end. One thing I really appreciated of from the book is sort of the historical count of the left, which I found quite fascinating. Which I don't know much about. So,
well, as I said to the guys, I'm having a bit of a crisis because I've never really questioned where what we know and how we know it, and we've sort of been soaked in a certain kind of left politics and elite left politics, and it's really quite disillusioning to learn where that's all come from. And I mean, one of the guys said that that the wheels fell off in 1979 or something.
Oh, well, didn't Steve say that the wheels are never put on?
Yeah, that's so there you go. Like this is the kind of the narcissism of us is to think that we're the center of the universe, and these guys are here to tell us that we know nothing, and we don't, and so that's why you need to listen to this episode.
Well, something you also need to do is you need to leave us a rating or review wherever you listen to the show. We're also on YouTube, so please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment there. Word of mouth is also a very powerful tool, so please tell all of your friends. And finally, to our Uber fans, if you love what we do, you can send us a little cash via the Buy Me a Coffee platform. Any donation here is very much appreciated. And now, on with the show.
No, we're not getting Ricky. Look, listeners, you only respond when I get tetchy with you. Okay, so come on, this is an abysmal amount of ratings. Okay, I want you all to do better. That's all I can say. Okay, the review is I know that takes time, but you can give us a rating. Come on, 32 reviews. Come on, surely this is better than Mamma Mia's podcast. What Mamma Mia Out Loud? What are they even talking about?
Yeah.
So just give us a rating. Come on, it's free. We don't have any ads. Ricky.
Make sure it's a 5-star rating as well.
Yeah,
not a 1-star.
I mean, for goodness sakes, I'm not even going to dignify that. Let's get on with it.
Professor Simon Winlow and Professor Steve Hall are renowned scholars who have published work together in the fields of criminology, social theory, philosophy, and history. Along with their many published papers, they have also collaborated on several books: Criminal Identities and Consumer Culture, Rethinking Social Exclusion, Revitalizing Criminological Theory Towards a New Ultra-Realism, The Rise of the Right, English Nationalism and the Transformation of Working Class Politics, and most recently, The Death of the Left, Why We Must Begin from the Beginning Again. Steve and Simon, welcome to the New Flesh.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
So you both had a lasting collaboration, which can be a lot like a marriage. And I'm so surprised that you're quite prolific. Just a little cursory search of the papers you've done together. I'm fascinated by your collaboration. How did you find yourself working together, and how do you work together?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that he's a supporter of this entity called the Sunderland Association Football Club along the road, and I'm a supporter of the Newcastle United Football Club. So we're actually great rivals. This is one of the great traditional rivalries in football. So obviously everything he says is wrong. So I had to start putting him right, you see, and he thought exactly the same. So we had this sort of instant dialectical war, of things, being, and so we hammer everything out. We're not joined at the hip. We don't agree on anything, and everything we say is a product of long discussions. When we first met, I'm a bit older than him. In fact, I'm quite a lot older than him. Most people. And we met when Simon was a young academic, and I was a bit longer in the tooth. We were doing our job, professional job, researching violence in the nighttime economy. We had a big grant from the Economic and Social Research Council. And Simon was doing some very dangerous work at the time, which no doubt he might tell you about. And when I'm sitting in the office gathering data and thinking about it, and we just realised that neither of us was satisfied. We're both from the northeast of England. We're from working class. We're both working class kids made good. We're not from the heart of the British imperial middle class, and we have our own worldview, which we found was
quite similar. And so we start talking about the need for new theoretical frameworks. We were dissatisfied with the answers that social science was producing at the time, dissatisfied with the direction of postmodernism. And so we started discussing ideas, and eventually we came around to the agreement that we need a new theoretical framework and we need new analytical frameworks. We need to revisit some of the empirical data that social science has been sloshing around for years, because we thought it was an awful lot of confirmation bias going on in research. Simply agreeing with what would be the canon, and we thought it was time for a bit of a change. So we worked, and this took a bit longer than we thought, really, Simon, didn't it? When we start off on this, and we're still being resisted and cancelled daily by when we challenge some of the ideas that have been around maybe a bit too long.
We were just, I think, to add to what Steve's already said, is we were always very committed social scientists. So we always wanted to know the world better. We always wanted new tools to try and understand the world better. And we never were happy with the ones that, traditional sociology and criminology gave us. So we wanted to have another look and have a look around and see what tangential ideas from philosophy and the broader humanities, what we could take from those fields. And also we looked around and tried to see how we could ourselves build new tools for understanding a rapidly changing world. So we were always, what brought us together is just that desire to try and go beyond what already exists in terms of the explanatory frameworks in the social sciences.
So, Steve, you mentioned the C word a minute ago, and that's cancelled. Is it true you were cancelled, and what for?
Well, I've been cancelled more times than I've had Todd dinners, I've been cancelled weekly at one point, I think that I'll tell you about final cancellation in a moment. But to give you an example of what Simon was saying, what he's saying is very true. And this is one of the fundamental drivers behind our project, is a dissatisfaction with the theoretical frameworks that we were forced to work within in social science. I'll give you an example of moral panic. You've both probably heard of this term. It's in common usage now. It's a social set. It was actually stolen by Stanley Cohen. You can trace the use of this term back into the 1830s, probably before, when the Surgeon General said, "Don't tell anyone that there's a cholera outbreak in all places in Sunderland." As a cholera outbreak, because it will induce a moral panic amongst the population. Now, he's known as the originator of this. Well, he's not. It's an old idea. It's an idea that really is the reverse of what it was purported to be at the time. And he sat in a cafe, watched some kids knocking seven bells out of each other on Brighton, as they tend to do on Saturday. The bikers versus the mods or something, I think it was. And there's sensational newspaper reports, the youth of today are terrible and all the rest of it. And he said, well, this is inducing a moral panic in the population. So the population of Britain is in a moral panic about youth. And then they're getting unruly and violent. Well, they can be unruly and violent, and I was quite unruly and violent at times myself as a youth, coming from the coal mining village where I was born. But we realised that who's frightened of who here? Who's really panicking? Was the Surgeon General panicking about the populist uprising that could have happened, and the potential mob violence that could have happened if there'd been knowledge of the cholera outbreak that spread? So where's the real fear? Is the real fear here that liberals who are terrified of populism and authoritarianism, that people will vote for authoritarian governments, if they think that their concerns are not being dealt with, will they vote? So who's in a panic here? It's not the people who are in a panic. Why we're diminishing public concerns. Now, if you diminish public concerns for too long, things fester. The public feel like we're in a post-truth society. We're not being told, we're being lied to. Yeah. So if you do that for too long, you're actually making things worse. Yeah. So we reversed that. We said, no, it's Stanley Cohen's who are in a panic. It's the Liberals who are in a panic about populism and the possibility that populism can take an authoritarian turn like it did in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. But if you read the history of populism, Thomas Frank's book's very good that people know, and we've researched it ourselves. Populism can take any turn. It can take a turn to the left, it can turn to the right, or it can just die out overnight. It can do anything. And so, really, we were being fed these terms of moral panic. It was the first thing I was taught as a student of social science. And I thought, well, why am I being taught about this? Why am I being taught about research methods and theories that explain things? Why am I being taught about a concept that actually induces fear? So this is an example of what we're talking about. And there are dozens of other examples of these really bad ideas that we could put them all into question, but they sort of students learn them, and as if they're just truths, truths and eternal verities that need. It's almost like being in a church, and reading catechism. And so we thought this won't do, and we set about making a few changes. And every time we would try to change something, we were cancelled.
Well,
So
I
we
think
got
it
used to
probably
the end, didn't
means
we?
that you're pointing towards true north in many ways. So you've come out of this field of sort of criminology or something to that effect, and you found yourself at some point disaffected with left politics and writing about that. So we'd love to hear how you've actually made that transition, and where did this book actually come from? What made you take the leap?
Well, I think obviously we were both, we grew up in the left. We grew up in the traditional, what we'll call this, the seed beds of democratic socialism. Steve through there in concert, and me in the city of Sunderland. And there were all areas that were dominated by the organised working class, trade union movement principally, but also things like working men's club systems and whatever else. And one was expected to adopt the ideas of kind of togetherness and collectivity and rallying round. And it was never perfect, but they always existed as kind of truths on which you could build a community. And then as we aged, I think it became increasingly clear that these things had been left behind in left politics. And so we kind of, with the neoliberal revolution, we were at first dismayed and then disappointed. And then, of course, as supposedly left-wing parties began to introduce new neoliberal reforms, we thought that the left was lost. But we always retained this kind of idea that there's going to be a resurgence, right? There's someone else who's going to come along, some charismatic authority is going to come along and push us in a different direction, or there's going to be a grassroots movement that is going to force the left's institutions to shift direction and once again represent the interests of ordinary people. And I think throughout both our lives, we've hoped, clung on to that sense of hope that soon things are going to turn around. And I think, especially since the last 10, 15 years or so, it's the recognition that they're not going to turn around, that there isn't actually in any of the institutions of the left the will to make significant interventions and improve the lives of ordinary people. And it's not just the institutions have been dominated and subsumed by neoliberalism, but even the radical elements of the left tend now to adopt the kind of identitarian politics of the liberal left rather than the communitarian socialism of the traditional left. And this means that we have arrived at an increasingly fractious moment where groups that would have once been together formed a communal socialist bloc to push politics in a different direction are now antagonistic towards each other in ways that I've never seen during my adult life. And I think it's the recognition that from nowhere on the horizon can we see anything positive changing for the left. So that, even the most articulate antagonists of neoliberal capitalism tend to avoid articulating a kind of an alternative. They're just against stuff, very negativistic. They want to tear down or change something about reality. They don't want to build anything new. They don't want to replace it. They're just angry at some injustice. And this really isn't taking us anywhere productive. And so our book is really based upon, first of all, that cold recognition, which is really something to kind of accept a reality you wish would never arrive. But then, of course, the hard work of kind of digging into the history of the left and doing the research necessary to understand its gradual progression as it moved from one era to the next.
So it's dawned on us that as millennials, we're products of, and you cover this in your book, of what you might call the new left, which, I suppose if we had to just pick some features, it would be individualism, globalism, multiculturalism, environmentalism, and open markets. So this was, Ricky and I, this is sort of the water that we were swimming in. And recently we've come to this epistemic crisis where we've realized that we've come out of this particular, we've been swimming in this water for our whole lives, and as it's become something else now. But what I was struck by in your history of the left before this was that you guys sort of suggest that the wheels came off long before we were even on the scene. So we'd love if you could give us some insight into the left in the time before what we know as the beginning.
Well, in a sense, the wheels were never put on. And that's what we're claiming. We're making some claims here that some have regarded as rather outlandish or extreme, but we don't think so because we've researched this thoroughly, and we're in a position where we're driven to research this because our people, the English working class, have been on the receiving end of an awful lot of problems in the capitalist continuum. And the left was really the only support they had. So the left has to function in some way, simply for us to lead tolerable lives. But if you look at the left in England, and we exported an awful lot of these ideas to the Americas and Australia. The European left is different. We'd have to write a new book about the European left. But certainly the Anglophone world, the left of our world, was never the left in the first place. I mean, the term came from the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a bourgeois revolution, had nothing to do with the working class. It was lawyers and businessmen trying to get rid of the Ancien regime and its restrictions. And the 19th century left from the Chartists right through to the Fabians. This is a continuum. This is the new left, isn't the new left. The new left is just a variation of the old left. And has never, ever allowed working class people to rise up through its institutional ranks and hold any sway or have any influence whatsoever. It's never allowed working people's ideas.
So the question, I guess, then, Steve, is why is the left? Why are they so allergic to the working class?
Because they hate us. And they regarded from the beginning, the working class were just putty to work on. They were Peter Turchin's notion that of course that rebellions tend to be led by what he calls the downwardly mobile elite, and this is true across most of history. You look at the Chinese rebellions, you look at the Soviet Union, you look at the French Revolution. They're all led by the elite. And if you look even at the Peasants' Revolt in the 14th century in England, John Ball was a priest. They were never led by the working class. So our ideas have always been either seen as too radical or prejudiced or bigoted or insular. And there's always something wrong with us. There's always something that needs to be improved. The working class is a congregation. It's never in the pulpit giving the sermon. It's always the congregation. And if you look at Henry Heinemann, the Social Democratic Federation, all of these working class led movements, they were suppressed from the very beginning. Karl Marx fell out with his only working class friend. I've forgotten his name now, but because he was questioning some of Karl Marx's ideas. And so we've just been kept at arm's length. And worse than that, of course, some of the Fabians, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, H.G. Wells, and all of these people, some were eugenicists who regarded the working class as feeble-minded. Not all of us, obviously, but the sort of bottom end of the working class is feeble-minded, and we should be bred out. So we've never been taken seriously. We've never been allowed to lead. And no matter how clever you are in a British university system, if you retain working class values, if you retain even your accent and what Bourdieu calls as cultural capital of the working class, then you're not going to rise into positions of leadership or influence. We're not allowed to lead ourselves. We have to be led. And I think that the suspicion that the working class is full of, that it's nationalistic, it's full of bigotry and prejudice, and we're a bit stupid, I think. It's sometimes, even that comes across. It doesn't matter how high your IQ is or how good your work is, it doesn't matter. You're coming from the wrong place. I sat on interview panels in universities. I always used to keep pretty quiet in these horrible affairs. And I've heard things, well, who should we select for this PhD? Oh, yes, she looks like one of us. She sounds like one of us. And for no other reason, not because the idea was great or that this person had a particularly good track record, but that she's one of us or he's one of us. And it's very much a culture that likes to continue itself. It's a culture of leadership. Don't forget the English education system was designed to train people to run the British Empire. And it's still, those values are still there, So, no, the working class has never, ever been the influential leader of the left, ever. And it's basically a continuum with variance. The new left simply took that to the extremes, where basically the working class was no longer the agent of history. We saw that after 1968, that little rebellion in France. They're always doing it, aren't they, French? Having these little rebellions. They thought that was going to be a new revolution, and so the likes of Pierre Victor and Michel Foucault and all the rest of these went out into the Renault factories in the fields, and they decided, well, we don't like these people. They're all drunken Catholics. They're all a bit sexist. They have traditional values. They like football too much, and they're no longer the agent of history. So let's dissolve this body into its various identitarian components, and let's see who we can persuade to be progressive, and we reconstruct. Now, Derrida, of course, had said that we can deconstruct everything, but we should never reconstruct. So they wanted to reconstruct, but only half-heartedly. Let's just see who's more progressive. Let's see if we can build momentum up from these various identitarian positions. 70s, 80s, that became a grift, where these identitarian groups form themselves into little social hierarchies, again under the same principle that the middle class should be leading in the working class. So working class blacks, working class gays don't get in as much out of all of this as the middle classes. And we've had reports of Black Lives Matter leaders becoming millionaires and buying property all over America, and it just becomes another grift, because you can't do anything else other than grift in a market society, because that's what markets are about. So it all just collapses, and they've got rid of the working class, they've got rid of the dangerous collectives. So that's a good thing. The identitarians think they're on a winner, they're not. And so the whole thing just collapsed, and we thought we'd better chart this. Depressing though it is, we'd better just try and produce some provisional knowledge to see if we get people thinking about it. And we found that some people agree with us, and they're thinking it's time for another change, and others are either ignoring us or seeking to cancel us again. It's all good.
Has Brexit given you hope at all?
No, not particularly. I don't think. It was an opportunity. It allowed the British state to wrestle back a degree of sovereignty from these extra national institutions. But of course, the Tory party in office at the moment remain absolutely committed to global neoliberalism, and there hasn't been a movement to reindustrialise or anything like that. And also, of course, that we haven't seen the kind of democratic deficit being plugged. So people feel that the institutions of the state remain distant. I don't think Brexit has opened up any real. It revealed something which had been hidden, which was an obvious class antagonism. So, the left's response, of course, is to dismiss anyone who voted for Brexit as being a mindless bigot. And this reflected the fact that the issues Steve raised in his last comment, where the working class, should follow the ideas given to them by their appointed leaders. And this has never been clearer. You see some of the social scientific analysis of Brexit, where Brexit voters have a lower IQ, and all of that stuff is being used to suggest that we need to rejoin, and that the dumb working class had been misled by signs on the side of a bus on the right wing press and all the rest of that, and that they're too stupid to form their own views. Whereas smart liberals, of course, could see immediately that remaining in the EU was beneficial for all. And of course, I think Brexit is useful for the only point that it revealed these hidden antagonisms. And for many, especially on the left, these antagonisms have been disguised, and kind of the carpet had been pulled over them to keep them hidden. And it revealed that underneath this apparent jousting between left and right was a hidden competition between the working and the middle class. And this isn't just a matter of the working class being left and the middle and upper classes being right. Obviously, the dominant sectors in every institution on the left are led by the enlightened, educated middle class. And the door has never been open for the working class. The only working class representatives who rise up in these institutions are those members of the working class who can learn their lines, can learn the correct form of argument, can correct their focus. If they adopt the ideas that they're given by their leaders in the middle class, amongst middle class liberals, then they can become kind of a subdominant elite within the kind of the left's institutions. Never at the top, because of course the elite keep those roles for themselves, but they can rise up to just below the elite because they articulate the right arguments.
Well, I've been thinking about the elite that you guys talk about, and my only way in it is that I know a few people, more than a few people, who work in arts and entertainment, and many of them are absolute disciples of this kind of ultra progressive new left politics. And some of them work, in just the mainstream commentariat or at the public broadcaster, our ABC here, which is the same as your BBC, and people who work, in drama and stuff like that. But I really get the feeling that what they really like, and I got this from your book as well, is what they really like is the freedom to do whatever they want all the time, but be seen as virtuous on the right issues. And at the moment, it's trans and the plight of black and brown people, but that could change. So I want to know, and I suppose it's kind of a liberalism, which I hadn't. I'm only just coming to terms with now. You go into this in your book. So liberalism, I guess, we describe as so individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and free markets. But I think typified by this a sense of freedom for the individual. So I guess these people, this elite, seem to be interested in serving themselves, but appearing to be virtuous. And I just want to know from your guys' perspective, how do these people get away with claiming the moral high ground when we all know they don't actually want genuine change?
That's a big question. It's a big cultural, philosophical question, and it goes back to the birth of liberalism. The distinction between political liberalism, economic liberalism. Free markets weren't always part of liberal thinking, and for the physiocrats came up with the idea of laissez-faire, and the idea of Smith's idea of the invisible hand, let the market just go. So it's a huge question, but I think I can sort of find a quilting point in liberalism that might sort of explain it, which was Isaiah Berlin's notion of negative liberty, this tension between negative liberty and positive liberty. Now, you're talking about negative liberty, which is the freedom to be left alone to your own devices, and it's anti-authoritarianism. So it's essentially negative. that authority is always bad. So Thomas Hobbes' notion of Leviathan, where you give up some of your freedom to allow yourself to be governed, and that should be done democratically, rather than in a sort of autocratic way. Obviously, we don't want to live under an autocratic government, but democratic authority. The word authority means to give people permission to govern you. So it's not a scare word that it is, whereas autocracy is a scary word, but authority itself shouldn't be that scary. I give people permission to do stuff all the time. If a joiner comes into my house and say, well, I don't know much about what you're doing, so here's the authority to do it. Let's see what happens. If it's crap, I won't pay you. So that's how democracy should work. But you have to pass over authority sometimes. Economics, for instance, and very few people understand economics. One of the problems we had with the EU is that the EU's rules on, for instance, fiscal responsibility, limiting government spending to 3% of GDP, means that the public investment just is restrained so much that it can't actually do anything to help the countries. I was on Belgian railways the other week, especially the best railways in the world. They're falling apart because public investment is not allowed in Europe. So the freedom, negative freedom, is about the freedom of the individual. It's an intrinsicalist position, what the philosophers call this is a principle we should stick to. But what are the consequences? Now, obviously, Berlin was actually, and let's not slag him off too hard, because he did see there was a balance between positive freedom. Now, positive freedom means we have to have the resources to be able to do anything. It's that classic old Marxist notion of the driving license. Driving license gives you permission to do anything, but that's no good unless you can afford a car. So positive freedom gives you the platform on which more people can have a car. So it means the driving license can be manifested in reality. So we need a balance of positive freedom and negative freedom. Liberalism is all about negative freedom. It has no consequential logic behind it. What do people do with freedom? What has Bill Gates done with his freedom? What has Elon Musk done with his freedom? What do child abusers do with their freedom? So we've lost this notion of moral judgment of the consequences of freedom. John Stuart Mill said, of course, that we should give freedom much as possible up to the boundaries of harm. Now, a young colleague of ours, Thomas Raymond, has written a brilliant book about harm, about the enigma of social harm. He said, we've never been able to grasp the notion of harm firmly enough to talk about authority in a knowledgeable sort of way. What is harm? When does harm start with? Where's the boundary of harm? When do we step over it? So this balance between positive freedom and negative freedom has never been approached by liberals in an intelligent way. And the cult of negative freedom can lead us down all sorts of directions, where people now, just every day, people are starting to question the notion of freedom. Is it a good idea to tarnish the notion of freedom so badly that people begin to question the principle? And that's when you get an authoritarian reaction. So our research in criminology in the past has looked the drivers towards, or the sort of authoritarian reactions that nobody wants to see. The main driver is extreme negative liberty and liberalism, because they're going to create that reaction simply by pursuing their project, taking their project to its limit.
I was just going to say that we now occupy an era which some have suggested can be described as post-68 capitalism. So during 1968, of course, you've got all the kind of revolts across Europe and elsewhere. And there's a fundamental change in the nature of corporate capitalism during this particular era. And lots of corporations and lots of business people and entrepreneurs began to pour scorn upon what they called the conservatism of the old capitalism, which was more steeply hierarchical. The image of people with bowler hats and pinstripe suits, and it was very masculine. And they suggested that the new capitalism that was developing into the 70s was going to become more hippie-ish, kind of more open, less patriarchal, less Eurocentric. It was going to draw in the entrepreneurial abilities of all the diverse people of the world. And we didn't need the state to do anything because we were going to draw upon all these entrepreneurial spirits around the world that give people the freedom that they desired. Freedom became integral to post-68 capitalism. It created huge expanses of jobs, the kinds that you're describing there, John, for upwardly mobile, educated, middle-class liberals to move into the corporate sphere to earn huge salaries and still believe themselves to be archetypal representatives of the left. The working class movement is forgotten. As we moved into this 1968 period, the idea of a working class orientated left, where that was fundamentally about economic management and was going to guarantee everybody, a reasonable platform to build a life of their own, that was forgotten. And it was about giving people more opportunities to experience a marketized liberal freedom. And this is where the left took us. And I think, we do criticize the kind of middle class liberal left, but they remain a subdominant left. The real, sound like a kind of Marxist here, but the entrenched power of the financial elites are the true elite. The subdominant elite, the middle class liberals who are usually in corporations and have cultural influence, are actually managing this post-68 capitalism in the interests of financial elites. Rather than, I know Matthew Goodwin would probably disagree with me, and he'd say that these middle-class elites are really the people who are pulling the strings. But actually, in many cases, they're doing in order to continue onwards in the path that we're on. It seems like in many cases they're radicals, but they're being radical in order that what already exists can continue. It's not a radical break, pushing us in a different direction. It allows the drivers that are producing a profound inequality across the globe to continue. And that's the real problem that the left faces now. If it continues to head down that path towards increased focus on liberalism, identities, it denies the kind of collectivity of old socialism, then we're never going to get to grips with neoliberal capitalism.
Sorry, Simon. I'm just going to jump in there because it's so fascinating what you say. Because I worked recently with some people who are on the business side of the world. And being from the humanities and in the arts, I got no idea about these people. And one guy has a family in construction. All the guys, it's in Sydney, private school boys, people from all this side of life. And I got the feeling that they don't think about the cultural left and these people, these power brokers that we think are power brokers. People I mentioned, they don't think about those people at all. So I find it really compelling, this idea that the people who at the public broadcaster who think that they're in charge, that they're not actually. They're really they've just been given a chit by someone, by this sort of business elite, the economic elite, perhaps.
They're the handmaidens for the corporate elite, maybe.
That's right, and it's not some sort of plan. It's not some sort of human relationship. This is just a logic that needs to be followed. The business, the myth, of course, is that business people should be freed up. We should have low taxes. We should encourage investment, encourage enterprise. And that's how we got rich. In fact, it's a myth because if you take the USA, for instance, the state controlled the construction of the railways and the opening up of the West. The state was hugely involved in all of this. If you read Mariana Mazzucato's book, The Entrepreneurial State, there are a lot of very good economists going around who are being completely ignored. And she's one of them. Well, she does get a mug on the telly now and again. And the idea that you free up business, you lower taxes, you reduce wages, you make profits, those profits are reinvested back in more business, the whole thing expands, more jobs are created, and everybody, it's all complete nonsense, of course. And an awful lot of for instance, the highest growth in the UK was 1945 to 1960, when the state was nationalising industries and doing everything that neoliberals said that we shouldn't do. We had the highest growth in our history. So it's a myth. It's a tissue of lies and half-truths. So it's a logic. Everyone follows that logic. Yeah, just promote business, make people free, encourage enterprise, attract investment. You try. It's like a sort of courtship. You have to woo these private investors. If you read Brett Christopher's work on the private equity companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, who handle all of the global investment, they basically control the whole world. They're in Ukraine at the moment discussing investment when the war finishes, where they can place their bets and their gambles in order to make loads of money on the reconstruction of a country devastated by war. It's entirely immoral. It's a logic everyone follows. So the handmaidens, as you put them, is exactly right. They know what side their bread's buttered on, matey. They know that they have their salaries. They keep quiet about all of this, and they reframe radicalism in cultural terms. Let's talk about equality. And we aren't against any of this. Believe me, we want to see that. Yeah, you can't argue with the morality behind it. That's where it's a very strong shield they've constructed, because you can't argue against gays getting equal treatment. You can't argue against bigotry. You can't do that. So as soon as you criticize this cultural turn, you can be very, very easily framed as a bigot. You see, they've got the whole thing covered. They've got the shields up. The whole campaign works very well. So it's logic. Handmaidens know that if they're going to get, let's be honest, cut to the chase. They're Jobsworths. Simple as that. We were Jobsworths, weren't we, Simon, when we first started? We were Jobsworths. We knew how to apply for grants. We knew what to say in interviews, talking bollocks in interviews. I never said anything in an interview that I really believed. And just to get a job. Once we got there in position of strength, we started to tell the truth. Then we got cancelled, but we're strong enough to resist that. We're intellectually strong enough to resist that. We're also physically strong enough. We're both pretty big guys, when we don't take.
They both, dear listener, both of these men look very hard.
Yeah, well, we're hard.
They do.
We're soft, really, but we're very resilient. And that was an aspect of masculinity that was quite useful to the left. If it was controlled, and if it was, I hate to say this, I'm going to be cancelled again, but it's a sort of righteous violence. There was a toughness about the left and a lot of the women, people like Ellen Wilkinson, I mean, they were tough girls. We really got stuck in, and we went out and we protested, and we wouldn't go back, and we were beaten up by the police in 1984, the miners, and the women were out there with us. And we were tough people, and they hate that toughness. And to soften us down and pulverize us and triturate the working class and turn us all into softies is a very good tactic. I've got to congratulate them. Well done on that one. You really domesticated us very, very well. We now lie on your lap and have our tummies tickled. So the idea of the traditional masculinity is now toxic masculinity. Is again an idea that I would question, and I would like to see some research into this, but you can't get any funding to do it. You can't get any time to do it. And as soon as you publish a book saying, well, maybe toxic masculinity is not a great idea, you get cancelled. So again, the knowledge is not provisional. Toxic masculinity is a thing. It's like a moral panic. It's like it's like you boil an egg for 3.5 minutes, and it's at the right, it's nice and soft. It's a fact. So you can't challenge it, and you can't really have a social science, can you, or a philosophy if you're not challenging concepts. So we haven't got either. It's all at a standstill. And now you've got these warring factions warring over these concepts that are set in stone. I'm a toxic male, but I was brought up as a traditional male. I was taught not to abuse children, not to hit women, not to hit people who were smaller than me. I was taught all these things, and I obeyed to, I said, okay, all right, Mum, all right, Dad, I'll try not to. I was brought up a toxic male, but it wasn't very toxic. It was a way of controlling what may be testosterone-fueled creatures that we are, a way of controlling ourselves and behaving in a civilized way. And that murder rate I was telling you about, 0.4% per 100,000 in 1956 in the UK, is probably the lowest murder rate ever experienced anywhere, in any time or place in the world. And it was, life wasn't that bad. It wasn't great, and we need to improve a lot. There was a lot of bigotry and prejudice.
I've seen Mad Men, and it doesn't look very good, is what they'd say. They'd say everything that happened 5 minutes ago was a hell realm, was a patriarchal hell realm.
Get rid of it. It's a great book, Tom Frank's book, Conquest of Cool Oil, and the advertising agencies changed in 1960. And all of a sudden, the family and all the old institutions that were the context for advertising, the mum and pop in the car with the two kids in the back, and all, was replaced by Marlboro Man. The individual riding out and leaving all that behind. The quicker the quicker we leave everything behind, the better life will be. I don't know about that.
Well, I want to get your take on family, because I feel like we're living kind of in an anti-family and an anti-children world in a way. Like, I mean, to take things like COVID lockdowns locked kids out of school, but also crazy stuff like drag queen story hour and sort of the LGBT stuff that's coming in for kids. Like, I want to get your opinion on the role of the family from a left perspective. Because I get the feeling that the left has some antagonism towards the family unit.
Yes, it's sorry, I'm out hogging this time. I'll say a couple of things and let Simon take over on that. You can trace this back to Engels as his notion of the family as the reproducer of inequality, of a privilege and violence and patriarchy and all bad things in the world. And the early communists wanted to dissolve the family and turn the world into sort of kibbutz-style communes. I went through all of this in the 70s. These communes were a laugh, I'll tell you. Oh, dear me, they're what an absolute mess. People, they were just horribly unstable things. I know. I lived in one for 3 months and tried this experimental lifestyles of the 70s.
They're very dangerous for children too, because the research shows that the more adults you have sort of around,
who was coming into and out of the commune, and so you didn't know who was influencing your child. I didn't have any children at the time, thank God. So the nuclear family has been attacked by the left for a long time. This feeds into far-right conspiracy theory, where they think, oh, this is some sort of, attack and replacement theory. They're trying to destroy all our institutions, destroy all our society. They blame this on the left, and they reinforce the conservative, the traditional conservative worldviews is simply reinforced by all of this. So the attacks in the family, I think, have been negative. The nuclear family is not perfect. But I mean, if you can't look after your kids, who the hell else is going to look after them? I mean, it's ridiculous. We have this biological parents and the obligation. Is there anything wrong with duty and obligation? There's another thing we have to question. Is duty a bad thing? Is obligation a bad thing? Not always, I don't think. Depends what you're obliged to and what values are at the core of that obligation. I've been obliged to my kids all my life. It's restricted my life. And at the same time, it's made it more joyful. And I think, the balance between those two things is important. And if you can't love your family, you can't love your neighbourhood, you can't love, we've got a beautiful coast up here in Northumberland, which I love, dearly. I sometimes think, well, if you can't love your own family, you can't love your own neighbourhood, you can't love anyone else's. You just can't love. And that's the problem, that the left seems to be so loveless, and their emotions have been redirected.
I think the what we might call the war on the family, obviously, as Steve said, there is a long history on the left, but that history reflected the fundamental antagonisms, especially in the 19th century, as socialism really began to get off the ground and began to move towards a mass movement, because those intellectuals who were advocating for the end of the family, Engels most notably, but also Proudhon and lots of other European leftists, were mostly middle-class liberals. Now, in many cases, especially with Engels, they advocated an economic program which was integral to their philosophy. But their anti-family concern never went over with the working class. And, the family has got problems. There are issues to do with domestic abuse in the 19th century, especially child sexual abuse. But most people have positive experiences of family life. And people didn't understand why the left was, when people were living in desperate circumstances as the industrialism began to develop. Why the left was concerned with stripping ordinary people of one of the institutions which actually gave them some support and some sense of satisfaction in their lives. And it's to do with the kind of, in Britain especially, we often talk about the left as being a broad church, but this is a fissure, a break within the left, going back to the 19th century, where intellectuals, who were mostly middle class because of educational advantages, of course, were generally speaking liberals and concerned with cultural issues, whereas the left for the working class were always concerned with economic management. For them, safety and security were always far more important than cultural freedom. Defending against the ravages of the world was always absolutely central to working class culture, working class political left. The institutions, most notably the trade union movement, were concerned mostly with protecting and advancing the interests of working class. And of course, the middle class bourgeois left were more interested in fighting cultural antagonisms, taking on cultural tasks. And of course, while that changed, and I'm kind of generalizing slightly, but right at the start there was this division between an economically focused working class who were mostly pragmatic, quite practical, and a more liberal, cultural focused bourgeois left. And of course, talking about the family, made the point, well, Freud, of course. Now we have the injunction that we should kind of love everybody from around the world and accept everybody from around the world as neighbours. But Freud's point is that this is always a kind of a fruitless task, because as soon as we say we love strangers, it reduces the meaning of love to those who are our immediate intimates. So our children's, the people who form the nuclear family with us. Those relationships are kind of reduced if we say that the love we have for them is equivalent to a complete stranger. So Freud was always making the point that this is it was always a fabrication. It didn't take us anywhere productive. And for love to really work, it has to be about close, personal, supportive relationships.
It seems as though the left always gets co-opted by kinkos and creeps and people with weird sexual fetishes. Who can we blame for this? Perverts, basically. Are the French to blame? Are they responsible?
No, I wouldn't dare blame the French on anything at the moment. No way. It was, the left has always been a sanctuary, and anyone with let's call it less than mainstream desires, and has always seen the left as a sanctuary and an advocate, and an organisation that would at least consider them to be part of the future rather than the past. And I know Alex Hokuley and Phil Cunliffe and his friends call this minoritarianism. The left has supported minorities against the majority because it's always seen the majority as a conservative obstacle to the new futures. This dreaming of a beautiful new future. And as Simon has just said, working class concerns are entirely different. They needed safety and security because they didn't have any in the 19th century. They were forced off their land, forced off their farms into these awful cities. And this is what Engels got right. So, when he was looking at Manchester, the condition of the working class, they had no security, no welfare, they had no property, they had no savings, they had no pensions, they had no vote. It was an awful condition to be in. And so they were obsessed with safety and security because they didn't have any. And the two groups have never been on the same page. They have different conditions, different desires, different needs. And the middle class left has always had this libertine streak, this Nietzschean idea of sort of moving beyond good and evil. You could trace this back to Descartes, to this sort of aristocratic devil-may-care attitude to the world. I'm above normality. I can just rise above normality, and I can construct myself as this beautiful free spirit floating around the stratosphere and look down at you poor quotidian proles who are doing all the bloody work that I need to making the chairs that I sit on and constructing the stages that I perform my ballet acts on, and you can just get on with that because that's all you're good for. Well, I become this wonderful. It is, as Christopher Lash described, this is just basically institutionalized narcissism.
Well, we have an interesting example here because there's a great podcast, Red Fem, and two actual, committed feminist Marxists, and Dr. Jen Isaacson on that podcast has often talked about the sexual misconduct of the men on the left and the inability of the left to deal with this behaviour. Also, I suppose, in addition, the absolute sort of lack of limits on sex and sexuality as well is built into that. But they have these concrete examples where Dr. Jen has been part of a collective, like various groups, like where they actually go out and pamphlet and do the old fashioned stuff, like on the ground material stuff. And there's always a guy who is in a position of power, and he ends up racing off some teenagers and blowing up the entire group. This has happened like more than once. So we'll get off sex in just a second, gentlemen. But does the left have a sex problem? I mean, they don't talk about security, which is what you guys have been saying that is what we should be talking about. That is that working class people and the material change, security is what's most important. Whereas we seem to be hearing a lot about this other stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And I know of Jen and their sort of feminist position, and I sort of agree, but in what she's saying, but it's one dimensional. I mean, I remember the 60s and 70s where because women regarded themselves as, following Germaine Greer and the sort of the second wave feminists as the oppressed and repressed and everything ending in ED or whatever, that they were. Women, the sexual misconduct of women was incredible because they were bursting out of this repressive environment, which is fundamentally reproduced by Christianity, I suppose, as the idea of the woman as the domestic servant and reproducer of the children. It was women. The sexual misconduct of women far outweighed the sexual misconduct of men. It was incredible.
I think you've just cancelled yourself
Great
again,
for me.
Steve. That's another cancellation for
I had a
you.
great time in the 70s. I tell you, I was a musician, and I wanted, bloody hell, it was just, whoa, I'm not used to this, because those were they were bursting out of this shell. And everyone was having a whale of a time. I don't think it was particularly patriarchal. I don't think it was particularly, it was actually great fun. But it was disastrous over the long term because I think it changed the values on which relationships were founded upon irrevocably. And it was, it was the old philosophical notion of the of the journey being great fun, but the destination not being too great. And of course, when AIDS came around in the early 80s, it put a block on that. And what that did was repress real sex again and expand the pornography industry. So the sort of sublimation, there was a re-sublimation at that period. So I think the feminist position, and again, I was cancelled for saying this, in 2016. The feminist position is probably right, but one-dimensional. I don't think it was simply sexual misconduct. I mean, the Russell Brand thing is, I disagreed with Jen on that. The Russell Brand has to go through due process because if we remove due process, we remove one of the fundamental civilizing planks of the West. We're not very good at civilizing ourselves, but without that, would be even worse. We have to retain due process, and the trial by media is an awful thing because it happened to me, 2016. I was jumped on by 500 feminists and simply for suggesting that the patriarchal continuum actually reduced violence, which I think I proved empirically without any doubt. And I said, they did it for the wrong reasons, that they're not good people, but that wasn't enough. You simply, you're presented with a canon of work you can't argue against, and I think all of the identitarian positions, including feminism, are guilty of that. And we need to break through that. We need to start to re-examine. Call me a revisionist, a permanent revisionist if you want. Call me what you want. But I think we need to re-examine all of these so-called truths and start to look at things again. So I agree with her, yes, but I think it's one-dimensional.
Yeah, I was just going to make the point that kind of point about marketized capitalist subjectivity. So the people that Jen's talking about, kind of middle class leftist men, understand their subjectivity, that they act out this subjectivity that's rooted in the accumulation of experiences. So every boundary on any behaviour is there to be overstepped. So nothing should be denied. Every experience should be accumulated. You should have as much sex as you can. You should take as many drugs as you can. You should never be impeded. You should never be obliged. You should do whatever the hell you want. It's an entirely negativistic subjectivity. It's an antisocial subjectivity, and and it's always been there within liberalism. And unfortunately, at particular points, it emerges in a really brutal form as leftist politics has changed across the centuries. And I think I have certainly encountered libertines masquerading as socialists, and they don't care about the traditional concerns of socialism. They don't want to change the world at all. They just want to wrestle free of every restriction and obligation that society might place upon them, so they can do something that is simply the product of their own internal desire. It would be that to have sex with children or to kind of leave their family or whatever it is. They want to kind of pursue their own desires unimpeded. And I think, obviously, that is perhaps now more than at any point in the left's history, is actually a feature of the dominance of kind of bourgeois liberal masculinities in particular institutions.
Well, gentlemen, while we still have you, I wanted to ask you a little bit about multiculturalism. So there are large amounts of legal and illegal immigration happening in the UK at the moment. And this is a polarizing issue for people. I guess progressives will wheel out the mystical, all-encompassing term multiculturalism as the reason why, there's nothing to see here. Isn't migration good? And I guess those on the right are more concerned with how it will impact jobs and shared resources and perhaps cultural cohesion. But I hate to sound cynical, but outside of cuisine and music, what does a diverse multicultural society give an average person? I mean, is multiculturalism a force for good or just a source of good food?
Well, again, it's one of the hot questions, and to question the liberal view of immigration and multiculturalism is another no-no. You do something you can't do. But and in keeping with our principle that everything should be questioned and revised, then we have to start looking at immigration rationally. Even Foucault, someone I have a detest generally, even Foucault said that really rationality is all we have. That's the only thing safe is trying to work things out. And immigration can be very, very good. And immigration can be very, very bad. And it can be everything in between. But what we do again is we apply this one-dimensional template to immigration. It's great; it can't be argued against, and it's great for everyone. It's actually not great for instance, the countries of origin. Let's take an example of Bulgaria, which during the heyday of the EU lost 26% of its population because the investors wouldn't invest in Bulgaria. Which lets the investors off the hook. The global investors, the private equity corporations, would invest in Bulgaria. Therefore, they lose 26% of their working age population. They lose demand, they lose productivity, and the economy tanks. So it devastates the economies. Ethiopia producing doctors. More Ethiopian doctors now work in Chicago than work in Ethiopia. So where are the Ethiopians going to find a doctor? So this, again, is the freedom of individuals to go around the world and find the richest country that they possibly... I'll say that again. This is the freedom of individuals to go around the world and find the richest country they can and prosper. Again, this is liberal individual freedom is behind this, rather than stay in their own country and make it better, because maybe they don't love their own country enough. I don't know. You'd have to ask each one. Multiculturalism can be a wonderful thing, except, of course, when there's a clash of norms. And if there's a serious clash of norms, for instance, that some cultures have a lower age of to permission to have sex, and some have a lower age of criminal responsibility. So you're going to get. So is there ever a compromise when these two cultures come together? There should be. But very rarely there isn't. So that there are problems that we just ignore and we skate over because we think multiculturalism is a great thing. So the answer I give you is that multiculturalism is just what it is. And we need to look at it rationally. It's going to have specific impacts, specific consequences, specific effects that we have to look at. But the problem is we are not allowed to look at them. And unless you look at them positively. So you must be positive about what we tell you to be positive about. If working class people in certain places in the UK might find that their jobs are rather insecure, and that an influx of immigrants might jeopardize their chances at the lower end of the market. It works well where there's a labour shortage in other parts of the market. If you need immigrants, then they come in and they work. There's no problem. And the other thing, of course, is that all of the sociological studies of yesteryear, the past ones, showed that when we have a healthy economy, jobs, incomes, we might need a bit of labour. People come into work. If they're working together, there's some famous studies of the car factories in Luton where immigrants were working with some of the longer settled people in the UK. They start talking to each other, realise they're human. They've got very same material needs underneath all of these cultural differences. They join the same union. They start talking about their kids going out too late at night and being worried about them getting all the same. They find they have similar needs and they start getting on together. And they start realizing that there are faults with each other's culture. They can learn from each other a bit. But if they're not working together, if they're in ghettos, if they're separated, and of course, an awful lot of, for instance, critical race theory is quite separatist. Yes, so that we should retain our separate culture. You shouldn't have yours, of course, but we should have ours. We retain our separate. It tends to increase that antagonism and isolationism. So I think that multiculturalism is a great idea in the right context, but it can cause problems in the current context of a declining economy, a market economy, and also of separatist cultural movements.
Simon, did you have anything to add?
Yes, I would just add that in many cases, multiculturalism acts as a cipher. It's not actually multicultural at all. It's actually monocultural. In many cases, what we're talking about, especially on the liberal left, are the movement of people from around the world, from various cultural backgrounds, who happen to be middle class and liberal, into Western cultures. And they read the same newspapers, they watch the same TV shows, they're dedicated consumers, but they've moved from maybe Africa or Asia or North America, wherever it might be, and they've landed in Britain. And we call that multicultural. But actually, in order for those people to be fully accepted, they have to accept the dominance of cultural liberalism in the institutions in which they work. So, for example, the professional and corporate, large corporations, for example, you've got to be liberal. They accept the cultural frameworks of the Western media, and they accept consumerism. And so, in many cases, there is no multicultural. Multicultural exists away from media commentary. It's on the background there. It's where those people who have no interest in integrating how those various groups kind of clash together. And in many cases, we're talking about only the surface issue, the diversity of people from around the world joining our monoculture and accepting consumerism as the abiding logic of the time, and forgetting everything else that goes on when various cultural groups occupy, for instance, quite neighbouring states in a large city or something like that. So I think what we're calling for when we're talking about multiculturalism in the book is a better understanding of what multiculturalism is and how it affects ordinary people in their everyday lives. And Steve articulated it very well indeed. How socialists address multicultural is to forget difference and to foreground sameness. What do we have that is shared? love of our children, an interest in a national sports team, and of course, relationship with the means of production, gripes about employers, problems with political representation. All of those things can be integral towards creating a new, vibrant culture that represents the reality of the societies in which we live. But if we focus on difference, we will never create a vibrant multiculturalism because all we'll have is separatism.
Well, I think that I want to give you guys the final word because we're very mindful of your time. I'm just going to leave this broad, and you can cover whatever you think that we've left out, or something that is that you're burning to get off your chest. But I'll just my provocative question, broad as it may be, is what do we the listeners, because we have a lot of disaffected lefties who listen to us, and a lot of people who are politically homeless. But what do we need to do to get the left we deserve?
Well, I kick that off, and I'll try and be as brief as possible because it's a huge question. But I'll try. I'll try to, I'll try to focus on what I consider to be the most important aspects. The final chapter of the book we call "A Return to Economics." Now, anyone who focuses hard on economics has been dismissed as an economic reductionist or class reductionist in the past, and I think we need to reject those rather harsh terms and focus on economics again to start to understand economics. Economics, the way we understand it, has been pretty much a set of myths propagated by neoliberals. We need to see neoliberalism as a project. It's not the Marxists get it wrong. It's not sort of some organic development in the next stage of capitalism. This was an agentic project. They first met in 1939, the Walter Lippmann Colloquium. Their idea was to roll the free market out globally and to disempower the working class and the state, the democratic state. This is why we have the democratic deficit. And they've succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They were funded very heavily by the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and to spread these ideas. And the focus of these ideas in economics departments and in schools and universities. The guy whose house I'm staying in now is one of the A-level examiners in economics. And trying to change the questions and change economics education is impossible. You must stick with the neoclassical, neoliberal myth. So we return to economics and we start wondering why our democratic representatives say things like the markets are telling us this and the markets are telling us this. The markets control everything. Yeah, what are the markets saying? Well, there's no such thing as the markets. The markets are a set of traders, right? They're market traders, money traders, financiers, investors, and of course, capital equity corporations and commodity traders. So there's no such thing as the markets. There are a set of decisions made by people. You either invest in a place or you don't invest in a place, okay? We come from the deindustrialized North. We're the victims of disinvestment or deinvestment, yeah? We stop investing. We go to the Far East because wages are cheaper, materials are cheaper, taxes are cheaper, and we can make more money. It's as simple as that, yeah? And what Yanis Farkas called the most audacious shift in economic history was to reverse the flows of global trade and capital, yeah? To make stuff in the East, sell it in the West, whereas before it was the other way around. Incredibly audacious amount of power and influence that people have, these financiers have in the world is incredible. So what we've got to do is learn something about economics. Why does the EU restrict fiscal spending to 3% of GDP? It's ridiculous. You can't do anything with it. We can't have public investment. The UK has the longest coastline in Europe. We could be selling electricity to Europe if we had massive public investment to create green energy. We could do anything. We can do anything we want. Unfortunately, it's people like Xi and Putin who are doing anything they want at the moment. Xi is producing the new, their very old idea, the safe boron nuclear power stations, building one a fortnight. They're building bridges all over China. We can do anything we want if we have control of investment and finance. We can create a world in which there's guaranteed jobs, loads of jobs that need to do. This whole damn country of ours needs repaving. You come to the UK and the pavements are all falling to pieces. There's places in this UK are derelict, they're ruined. And we live in the northeast. There are more ruined places up here than anywhere else. The old mining and industrial areas. We need to rebuild the whole country. Something you probably don't have in Australia because you're a newer country, but this is a very old country, lads. Very, very old. And it's fallen to pieces. There was a symbolic act the other day. Someone cut a 300-year-old tree down in a natural beauty spot, Sycamore Gap. And it seemed to signify the ruination of our history. This is something we live in amongst ruins. Of course, the southeast, incredibly prosperous, London, the southeast, but up in the north and Wales, places like this. We need to rebuild the country. We can't do that unless we have control of finance investment. We need to learn economics. We need to challenge neoliberal orthodoxy. We need to teach kids about it. I'm not saying we should run away from the arts, that we should diminish the arts. The arts are incredibly important. I'm a former, I still play. I'm a jazz musician, an active jazz musician. I love art. I love music. But in a healthy economy, music and art prosper too. People have more spare time and they feel uplifted and they feel like they're driven. Art at the moment is rather depressing. I find it's a sign of the times. So we need to return to economics, and we need to start getting our heads around the economy and how economies work and how it can start to rebuild, reconstruct the nations in which we live. It's got to be done at the national level, and that's not because I'm a nationalist, it's because Wolfgang Strick is right. It's the only feasible unit of political economic organisation. Regions are too small and the world is too big. So you have to do it at a feasible level. Also, of course, national currency is important because the power of the national currency, Australian dollar or the British pound, is what we have. That's what we have to spend. But people will accept that currency in return for goods and services and materials. As long as we have that currency, we can do what we want with it. As long as we control inflation, and there are ways of controlling inflation that are not talked about. So we need to get back down to this, rebuild our countries, give people a little bit of safety and security, and can we just have a breather from neoliberalism just for a couple of decades, to just get rid of the stress and just return to some sort of sensible way of life. And then we find culture changing along with that, and I think those changes would be possible, would be positive, as the work from the past shows. I think we could have more positive cultural changes in a more secure economy.
I think, to continue what Steve has said, I think the left has to stop seeing itself as a collection of activist movements. I think the lens of activism has been incredibly destructive for the left. So, of course, the activist lens encourages us to find things out there in the world that we're against. So we're fighting against all the negativities of neoliberalism. We should see ourselves as a power in waiting. And if we're a power in waiting, we're going to have to come up with some strategies for improving the lives of ordinary people. Not being against something, but being for something that can be identified. Allowing people to see in your policies a benefit for them and their people. This is how the left should present itself. And of course, to do that, to get over the minefield of cultural antagonisms, we have to stop arguing the toss about who was the victim, who was the greater victim, who was the oppressor. And we have to return to the field of economics, where we have obviously things in common in overcoming the present dominant ideas of neoliberalism. Because unless we do something, unless we intervene and create a new economic platform for ordinary people, we're going to descend increasingly quickly to something that resembles feudalism, where the gap between rich and poor can't be breached, is enormous and growing, and people are forced to kind of root around for the scraps from the master's table. And unless we can come together and find a strategy for moving forward economically, then we're going to remain divided. And as we're divided, we're going to remain easy for elites to dominate.
Absolutely. And say one more thing, just one little thing. Did anyone see Swaran's Children of Men, the movie?
Yes.
Well, remember the last scene, but when they were leaving behind all of these antagonisms, the antagonisms Simon's talking about, these are antagonisms of the past, and the politics of the past that were supposed to transcend these antagonisms didn't work. They failed. And the ship came in. Do you remember the ship? It came out of the mist in the harbour, and on the side of the ship, the Human Project. The ship was called the Human. That's what we need. We need that ship to come in. That ship has to be built. It has to be made. We have to understand how it's made. We have to understand. We have to get on board, and we have to sail away from those divisions. Accept that we do have different sexualities, and we are from different parts of the world. We wear different hats and have different colour skins, and create an economy in which people can move around the world, but don't have to. If they want to stay home, they stay home. If they want to move somewhere, they can move somewhere. Yeah, because we have stable economies. We can only do that by creating stable national economies, fair terms of trade, and this is a huge project. Yeah, huge project, but we need to start thinking about it, and the left needs to focus on this move forward. Otherwise, as Simon says, it's dead now. It needs to resurrect itself on that as part of that project, as the fundamental driver behind that new project.
Well, we do have a final quick question that we ask all of our guests, and we'd like to know what you're reading right now. So maybe, Simon, what have you got on your bedside table at the moment?
Oh, I'm reading a collection of books about the English primarily, but their experience of the Dark Ages. So a lot of stuff on Anglo-Saxon Britain, a lot of stuff on Vikings and raids and the development of Christianity. And of course, I'm drawing parallels to the eventual decline of Western civilization and what we can learn about the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Dark Ages.
So it doesn't sound like you're reading about any people of colour. It just sounds very white to me. Bunch of white people. That's all you care about, clearly.
I don't know what colour they were. I don't care.
Steve, what are you reading at the moment?
I've just finished reading Yanis Varoufakis' Techno-Feudalism. What Simon's keeping secret there is that we're writing a new book. I'm not convinced by techno-feudalism. I don't think we're going back to a feudal era, because feudal era had a moral centre, it had an accountable hierarchy, it had all sorts of things that we're not seeing today. So we thought the Dark Ages were better ideas. So he's looking at the Dark Ages of post-Roman Empire and in Europe before Christianity was settled in after about the 12th century. I'm looking at the Mycenaean Dark Age of the Iliad and how Mycenaean civilization fell apart. And I'm reading stuff, Moses Finley, about that, and reading the Iliad and thinking to myself, if it is barbarism rather than feudalism, that we're looking for a period of barbarism, of soft barbarism, thank God it's happening in virtual reality and not in reality like it did in the Iliad, because it's the bloodiest thing I've ever read. Some of the violence of those days when they were facing last man standing battles with sharp implements. It was just too horrific to even think about. So I'm reading about that to see if, because we agree with Yanis's economic analysis, but we don't think feudalism is a very good analogy. So we think it might be more of a techno-barbarism. So that's what we're looking at the moment.
Well, while we wait for that book, people need to read the current book, and that is The Death of the Left, Why We Must Begin from the Beginning Again, available everywhere you can get books. It's on Kindle, it's in in old-fashioned paper and Audible as well. So, gentlemen, where can people find you online? How can people follow your work?
Well, we did have a Death of the Left account on Twitter, but we pulled it. Twitter's a cesspit, as you know. But Simon's still got his account there, and with his followers, and he's more even-tempered than I am, so he's sort of handling all that. I can get a bit anyway. He's doing that, so Simon will be advertising from his Twitter account, and hopefully the publisher, whoever will be doing a bit of work for us. Some hope, but we'll the usual channels plus Twitter. Follow Simon on Twitter. Follow Simon Winlow.
Everyone needs to follow Simon. That's the old handball that Steve's doing there, getting rid of to Simon. But I just want to thank you for coming on today, because it's such a gloriously hopeful message that I got out of it, even though, at times your book is a bummer. I think but I think the message ultimately is hopeful, and that we should be focusing on what unites us and not what divides us. And I just want to say, guys, that don't worry about your accents, because to us convicts, you all sound like the king. So
There's a big argument, right? I don't know if you probably want to put that POM, I thought was prisoner of Millbank, on the back of those shirts, because Millbank was the leaving point where but an Australian academic said that's not true.
Yes. What does it mean? It means it's a type of oh God, I knew it. I've even read it. It was in I think it might have even been in Thomas Keneally's history book. But it means a certain type of ticket that you had to come over or something.
Right. So it doesn't mean prisoner of Millbank. POM wasn't prisoner.
I don't think so. No. But we know you. We know you from a kilometre away when you come here. By the way, you stick out. You're pale, and you
first get sunburned.
Inappropriately dressed always,
Absolutely.
and probably whinging about something.
But I mean, all I have to say, you guys, just don't be too hard on Eddie Jones. He's not bad.
What an embarrassing!
He took an awful
game.
hammer in there. I mean, that was just embarrassing. I won't tell you about what I did with my popcorn and my pint while I was watching it. But
we deserve it. We deserve that.
You're better than that. You're better than that. But it's a young side. They'll come through. He's right. The youngsters will come through.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah,
gentlemen, thank you very much.
Lovely, mate. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.